and enthusiastic learners on the third day of this 5-day national symposium. This event is a celebration of insights and knowledge sharing from experts in English language and literature, and it promises to enrich our understanding through thought provoking discussions and meaningful engagements. National symposiums like this serve as a beacon of academic inquiry, fostering critical thinking and intellectual collaboration. They provide us with the opportunity to challenge established perspectives, explore innovative ideas, and envision a future grounded in knowledge and inclusivity. Today, we continue this journey with yet another impactful session that aligns perfectly with the theme of.
Sorry, but I can't hear you at all. I think your audio is gone. It's okay now, Sunil. Yeah, it's fine.
Dr. Bhattacharya is a renowned academician, currently serving as Professor and Dean at the Center for English Studies, Central University of Gujarat. With a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, his illustrious academic career spans decades, marked by groundbreaking research in language, technology, and cultural studies. His prolific contributions to the field both in India and globally have left an indelible mark on the academic community, making him one of the most respected voices in the realm of English studies. Before we begin, I would like to invite Dr. Sunil Shah to chair this session. Dr. Shah's guidance and expertise will further enhance our discussions today.
Since it is online, I can share from here. Yes.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Shah. Now, without further ado, I invite Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya to commence this session on the subject Colonialism, Textbook and Material Production. Dr. Bhattacharya, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive introduction, I must say. And I thank the English department. It has been a great friend over years. Professor Mahesh De, especially, Professor Paresh Joshi, Professor Sunil Shah, Dr. Amit Prajapati, Dr. Mihir Modi. These are the faces that I can see on screen. And all my dear students, it's wonderful to see you. I don't know how cold it is in Surat. It seems that it is not very cold. People are just wearing full shirts. But in Calcutta, it's quite cold. Anyway, so what we're going to talk about today is a bit of a history of textbooks. And I'm sure that as students and as teachers and as former students, we have gone through this experience of having textbooks in the classroom, right? So we will have at different stages, at different levels, at primary, secondary, high secondary, sometimes even at the BA levels, we used to have textbooks. And textbooks had a certain format. So we needed textbooks. There were certain principles that were followed. These principles changed over a period of time, how to create textbooks, how to create materials. So technically in ELT, textbook production is called materials production. Now, for materials production, over a period of time, the nature of materials itself has changed. The debates around materials have changed. Debates around how to teach has changed. So methods of teaching has changed. And depending on how textbooks, what are the methods that are in current circulation, what are the different kinds of ELT principles that are in current circulation, also determines the nature of textbooks. So textbooks, remember, are a very dynamic things. It's not something very static. So it's not that a textbook will remain over a period of 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, because with the change of principles of teaching, methods of teaching, principles of textbook production, the nature of textbooks also keep on changing. Now, in order to understand, therefore, what really textbooks did, an interesting story to begin with. Remember, English as a subject was not taught in England for the first time. Because in England, English was not seen as a subject fit to be taught. It was not a very prestigious language. The language of prestige in England in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and if you have read your Shakespeare, I'm guessing these are MA students and research scholars. So if you remember, when Shakespeare dies, Ben Jonson says that I don't know how he wrote all these plays because he had little Latin and less Greek. So the languages of prestige were Latin and Greek. The languages of prestige was not English. You could write in English, but this was meant for popular consumption. For intellectual consumption, for academic consumption, the language was Latin and Greek. So again, if you remember in the 16th century, when Francis Bacon is writing his famous essays, and I'm sure that MA you have done some of those essays or PhD scholar, he's writing essays in English because it is meant for popular consumption. But when he's writing serious scientific stuff, he's writing in Latin. So his Novum Organum is in Latin. He's not writing in English. So science is to be written in Latin, while English is meant for more popular mass consumption. Okay, so English is never taken seriously till about the 18th and the 19th century. Now, when the British started spreading their wings and the empire started expanding, and they started occupying different kinds of countries and started establishing colonies, they suddenly realized that English was required in order to govern. So in order to control all these colonies, you needed some sort of a common language. Now, if you look at 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century onwards, when English colonialism started spreading, they went to different kinds of places. And they had different kinds of policies of education, policies of teaching. So when they went to Africa, it was very simple for them. They simply, because most of the African languages were oral languages, they did not have a script. And since they did not have a script, the English started believing that these are non-civilized people, they don't have a script. And therefore it was very, very easy for them to introduce English education. So in Africa, it was very common to have schools set up mostly by missionaries at the beginning. Later, with the help of the government or whatever the company was operating at that point of time, they would set up schools and give educations to students. And this education was mostly in English. But let's not go to different colonies. They had a different policy, for example, in Hong Kong, where they set up their colony. Let's come to India. Now, remember when I'm talking about India and the British coming to India, at that time, India is not India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. So we are one country. So it's undivided India. And when the British came over here, they realized they encountered a very serious problem. What is that problem? And that problem is, here is a country which not only has a huge number of languages. Remember, there is no one language in India, right? So different provinces of India and different villages of India almost produce different kinds of languages. But that is not the only problem, because even Africa, you had a series of languages. That's not a problem. The problem that the British encountered is that most of these languages have a written script. Okay? So there are languages in writing. They are written languages. These are not oral languages. Most of these written languages follow the Devanagari script, but there are other forms of scripts also available. Now, what do you do with a culture which has a written script? They had not encountered this. It was easy to deal with oral cultures, which they also did in India. For example, many of the tribal cultures in India were very easily assimilated because they could set up schools over there. It was mostly oral stories, oral forms. They did not have a script of their own. Well, whatever scripts they had was lost. And it was easy to set up schools and teach English. But what about other forms of languages which had written scripts, and how do you introduce English over there? And this created a huge amount of debate. So how do you teach a language, first of all, which has not been taught in England? So you don't have a model for teaching. Okay. The only model for teaching English in India is the model of teaching Latin and Greek, because Latin and Greek are the languages that are taught in England. The second problem is, how do you teach a language to a population which already has a different form of a script? And how do you include that? So what we call textbooks today and what we see as textbooks today, so all our experiences, has a massive, massive history in India. So it's not that textbooks suddenly started cropping up post-independence, 1947. Textbooks had a long debated history and discussed history in India. And therefore, what I'm going to do today, and this was just the background, is to try to look at that history, because it's important to understand what is happening today in ELT, textbook production, materials production, etc. In order to understand that, you need to understand that what we call as materials production today, or what we call as textbook production today, is not a unilinear path. It's not a singular path. Okay. There were different kinds of paths that were available to us. And those paths are very interesting ones, which some of them are coming back. And so we need to understand where are they coming back from. Some of them are very new, but also has a historical trajectory. So there is a historical link to what is happening now. And therefore, it is important to understand that history of textbook production. And probably then we'll be able to understand what kind of textbooks do we really need, because this is a serious problem even today. So even today, I'm sure many English teachers would say, well, it's very difficult to teach English, so students are not learning English, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is a similar situation that the British faced over here, because they were trying to teach a language that had never been taught in England, and they were trying to teach a language vis-a-vis other languages that had scripts. Okay. So I do have a presentation, so I'll share the presentation with you. Okay. So I told you a brief history of colonialism. Now, if you want to go by dates, then I'll just give you a very brief history of the dates of how colonial setup started happening in India. So all of you remember that in 1757, the Battle of Palashi was fought. In the Battle of Palashi, which is very near Calcutta actually, the Nawab of Palashi, or that place, Murshidabad, it was called, the Nawab of Murshidabad was defeated by the British Lord Clive. And this was followed by another battle in 1765 called the Battle of Buxar. And in the Battle of Buxar, the entire Nawab army was defeated. The Bengal, what we call Bengal today, in those days, Bengal included Orissa, parts of Assam, and parts of almost the whole of Bihar, not the northern part of Bihar, but the southern part of Bihar. So it was a big province. It was bigger than UK as a province. So the entire Bengal province was handed over in 1765 by the then Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. So Shah Alam handed over this province to the British in 1765. I'm just giving you the dates to make you understand what is the historical context in which textbooks start getting produced. Now in 1765, therefore, the British set up their capital. Well, at that time, it was a very small area of India, Bengal. They started setting up the city of Calcutta. And Calcutta was a kind of a city, very small town. And when the British took hold of Calcutta, they started setting up the city. Now, immediately they realized that they needed education. Okay. But remember, before the British became the government, at that time, I'm calling them British, it was actually a company, the East India Company. So the East India Company and the British realized that they needed to have schools, they need to have, because there is a lot of people, educated people in Bengal who wanted education of some sort. Yeah? So they needed to set up schools, they needed to set up colleges. And when they started setting up schools and colleges, they encountered what I said at the beginning of the story, the two problems. If you are setting up schools and colleges, you need to teach English. And how do you teach English? You don't know, because there is no model for teaching of English. And how do you teach English to people who already have other scripts? So what they started doing, and I'll cut the long story short, is they started setting up institutions. So one of the things that they started doing, for example, was the idea that we will have different sorts of educational institutions. It's not that we're going to have only one kind of educational institutions. This was the original policy. Of course, that was changed later. What will those educational institutions teach? Now, before I go on to that story, I must say that I'm just going to focus on the 19th century. I'm not going to come to the 20th century, but we'll ask questions about textbook production today. And I'm going to focus on the teaching of English, and I'm going to give my examples from Bengal and Gujarat, because the British also reached Gujarat, remember, by 1820s, 1830s. And I'm not really going to go into print production, how books were produced, etc. I'm just going to look at textbook production, how materials were produced. So what they did, to continue with the story, they started setting up institutions, different kinds of institutions, not only teaching institutions, but also institutions that could train teachers, for example, that could train administrators, for example, that could that could produce textbooks. And textbooks not only in English, textbooks in different languages, for example, in Bengali, Hindi, Odia, etc. Now, these institutions played a very important role in producing textbooks during this period. I'll just point out a few of them, but you can always go back and read more on them. There's a lot of research that has happened on this. So I'll just show you some. So the first part of the story, as you look at the title, is colonialism. So I'm going to talk about colonialism and colonial institutions in the first part of the talk. So what are the institutions that they set up? So on the left-hand part of the screen, on the top, left-hand corner top, you see that there is this small page from a document, which was called the Calcutta School Book Society. Now, Calcutta School Book Society was set up in 1817. What was the function of Calcutta School Book Society? As the name suggests, it was supposed to produce school books. Okay. Now, remember the original problem. The original problem is that you do not have a model for producing books for teaching of English. And the original committee of the Calcutta School Book Society had not only Britishers, but also a large number of other scholars from different languages. For example, there was a Persian scholar, there was an Arabic scholar, there was a Sanskrit scholar. There were scholars who were trained in English, Indians, who formed a part of this committee. And they decided how to go about it. One of the important things that they discussed and decided upon in this Calcutta School Book Society, remember, it was a very, very powerful institution. It decided, it's like the school textbook board, or it's like the NCERT today. Yeah? So it decided what kind of textbooks are going to be used in the classrooms. So they decided that since we have two forms of scripts, so we have the English Romanized script, but we also have the Bengali script, which was not standardized, but it followed the Devanagari pattern. We'll use both the scripts, okay, for textbooks. So the teaching that would happen would mostly be bilingual. In the initial phases, 1817 I'm talking about, there was hardly any monolingual teaching of English. So English classrooms would never be simply English classrooms. They would always be bilingual classrooms. So you will have Bengali English, Hindi English, Odia English, etc. Now, in order to do that, of course, you needed dictionaries, because you needed words in English and words in Bangla, words in English, words in Odia, etc. So a large number of dictionaries were produced during this period, and these dictionaries were used in the classrooms. you needed stories. How do you teach a language? So you needed stories. So a large number of translations started happening. For example, from the Jatakas or from the Panchatantras. A large number of these stories were translated, then they were put into textbooks, and then they were brought to the classroom and taught. Okay? And to do this translation work, if you look at the second picture on the right top corner, this is the picture of Asiatic Society of Calcutta. And Asiatic Society was central to this translation project. So they used to translate huge amounts of texts from different Indian languages. Remember, their focus was on Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian because they felt that the regional languages did not have standardized forms. In those days, of course, many of the regional languages did not have standardization. They did not have standardized forms of script or standardized forms of speaking or standardized forms of writing. So they kind of concentrated on the classical languages, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, and translated those texts. Those texts were then used in the classroom for teaching. Okay. We'll come to what happened when teaching happened. We'll come to that later. The third on the top left corner was another institution which was set up a bit later called the Hindu College in Calcutta. This was again set up in 1817, and the Hindu College became a center for learning, for higher learning, so college learning. In those days, remember, college did not mean first year, second year, BA, etc. In those days, college was collegiate. So you could do 3 years of your 11, 12, and first year at Hindu College. So 11th onwards, you could go to the college. So Hindu College was set up, and again, there were textbooks for teaching. You needed textbooks at a higher level. So sometimes English literature was used, or English literature. So for example, Shakespeare was the most popular one. But you had Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, the kind of text that you read even today. And this started in 1818. So we are already almost 200, more than 200 years over that period, and we are still reading them. So Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was there, Wordsworth was there, Shelley and Byron were not there, because Shelley and Byron were seen as extremely difficult poets in the sense of they had too many revolutionary ideas, so they should not be taught, because you do not want to give revolutionary ideas to natives. So this was Hindu College. And the fourth image that you see over here on the bottom right-hand corner is the Asiatic Society of Bombay. This was set up much later in the 1860s and 70s, but this was actually inspired by something that was set up in Ahmedabad called the Forbes Gujarati Sabha. And the Forbes Gujarati Sabha, of course, has a huge tradition, a huge history. And the Forbes Gujarati Sabha was also instrument in producing textbooks. One of the things that it did along with translations was producing textbooks for schools and sometimes colleges. Remember, some of the most famous colleges were at that time in Ahmedabad or in Surat. So these were the institutions that were set up. Just to kind of repeat what I said. So one is the textbook board as we understand it today. Calcutta School Book Society. Similarly, you had the Madras School Book Society, you had the Bombay School Book Society, etc. You have the Asiatic Society, which takes up translations of Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian texts, which are then used as textbooks. But you have also Asiatic Society of Bombay, you have Asiatic Society of Madras, etc. You have colleges being set up, like Hindu College. You have the Banaras Sanskrit College being set up almost at the same time. And you have other kinds of institutions that produce this production of textbooks. So textbooks are produced along with these institutions. So you need these institutions for the production of textbooks. So textbooks are ready. You take them to the class. What do you do with them? Okay, that's a question that you keep in mind, and we'll come to that question a bit later when we talk about materials production and methods of teaching. Now, there are some interesting phases of the textbook production. As I said, that this is not a unilinear and a homogeneous process. There are lots of different directions that textbook production took. And it depended on the particular context in which it was produced. Now, all of you as English students would know Macaulay's Minute of 1835. I mean, everyone blames Macaulay for the introduction of English. And I think it is terrible that, historically terrible, that because you need a villain in history, right? So in order to have a villain in history, you need to find someone. That this is the man who introduced English and created all the trouble. But that is not true at all. Because Macaulay's Minute, and we'll come to that in a moment, though it was written in 1835, and Macaulay did say terrible things about India, things like we need, an army of servants, etc., etc. So we need people who will act as a middlemen between the rulers and the masses. He also said terrible things like one bookshelf of Europe is better than the entire library of India and Arabia and Persia, etc. And his major argument, of course, all of you know this, is that English should be the medium of instruction. The government should not spend any money on the teaching of other languages. So all the government money should be used for teaching of English. So if the government is spending money, or the British government should spend money only for the teaching of English. This was his main argument. Now it's interesting that Macaulay has been seen as a villain. But if you look really historically deeply, then you will notice that Macaulay's Minute hardly had any impact on Indian education, hardly. Okay? And we'll come to that a bit later. So though Macaulay's Minute, of course, made, for example, Hindu College English medium, some of the schools in Calcutta English medium, it hardly had any effect in any other part. So it had an effect in cities like Bombay or Madras or Cuttack or Calcutta, but it hardly had any effect on the kind of teaching that was happening outside the cities. Okay? And this is found in the second report that I mentioned on this slide called Adams Reports of 1835 and 1838. Adam actually in 1838, we'll not go into the 1835 report, 1838 reports that one of the things that you notice is there is a lot of Gurukul and Madrasa education that is still going on, only 10 kilometers from Calcutta. Okay, it's not even that you have to travel 50 kilometers. Just in the outskirts of Calcutta, you have a large number of Gurukuls and Madrasas. But Adam also pointed out that these Gurukuls and Madrasas are slowly dying. Primarily because, see, Gurukuls and Madrasas were based on a system called patronage system. So you had the local Zamindar, or you had the local Nawab or king or whatever, the local Raja, who would give money for these Gurukuls and Madrasas to operate. Yeah. Now, because of the coming of the British and because of the British taking territorial expansion very seriously and taking away the powers of the local Rajas and the Nawabs, they did not have any money for sponsoring the Gurukuls and the Madrasas. So they were slowly dying in that sense. Let's come to the third document, Wood's Dispatch of 1854. Now, what Wood basically did was he did a survey of English education in India. And he said that, well, despite Macaulay's Minute, it seems that English has not really reached anywhere at any point of time, except a few elites who have learned English in the cities. English has not trickled down to major parts of India. And he wanted the British government at that point of time in 1854 to send more money so that English education, teachers could be trained in English, teachers could be sent to schools and they could teach English, etc. So he needed more money for that. In 1882, another report was published, and this is, remember, 50 years after Macaulay's Minute, almost 50 years. And this was published by William Hunter. And William Hunter said that it has been a complete failure, English education in India. There are different methods that are being followed. There are different ways that people are being taught English, but it has not been successful at all. So English has not spread. So the original idea that English would spread across the masses and all other languages will be replaced by English is completely gone out of the window. So this idea of English replacing other languages is gone, because Hunter says that it has been a complete failure in India. So the British policy of teaching of English has failed. Yeah. In order to do that, he gives a certain series of solutions to make sure that English is spreads more equally. But of course, that also doesn't happen. The last act, and I'll be very brief in this, was something called, so there was the Governor General of India at that point of time. The British Governor General was Lord Curzon. And Curzon was a very paranoid man. He was always, especially after 1857, he was constantly in fear that the Indians are going to rise up in revolt again. Yeah? And remember, by 1880s and 1890s, Indian nationalism has started taking shape. There are a lot of people who are already talking about Swaraj. In 1905, there is already the Swaraj movement. So there is a lot of fervor and a lot of thinking about nationalism, a lot of thinking about a separate Indian nation, free from British, etc., taking shape. And in that atmosphere, Curzon, what he does is he brings about what he calls the Indian Universities Act. So all universities, remember there are 5 major universities by that time. In 1857, the University of Calcutta is founded, University of Madras is founded, and University of Bombay is founded. And in 1881, the University of Lahore is founded, and then the University of Allahabad is founded in 1882. So you have 5 major universities. There are also minor universities here and there. So the Indian Universities Act says that everything has to be taught in English. So all higher educational subjects, be it sciences or arts or social sciences, in those days, not much of social sciences, but everything has to be taught in English. So there can be no other Indian languages in higher education system. Of course, there is a lot of protest against this, etc. Now, it's important to know this bit of history to understand how textbooks were produced. So after Macaulay's Minute, there is a kind of a spurt of textbook production. A large number of textbooks start getting produced in English. But after Wood's dispatch, people suddenly realize these textbooks are not having an impact. So they start thinking about how do you change the textbooks so the textbooks can have an impact in the teaching of English, etc. We'll go through that history a bit and we'll look at some textbooks and the kind of textbooks that were produced. Yeah. So now, before we go into that, I think it'll be a good idea to understand that teaching of English in India, we generally think the British came and we started learning English. It's not true at all. Because much before the British, the missionaries had arrived. And there is a whole history of missionary education. I'm not going to go into that history. I've given you the references over here, so you can look up these references and see how missionary education. In fact, there was a clash and conflict between the British government and missionaries because they didn't want missionaries to take over education. They wanted control of education. So there's a huge conflict, almost 20, 30-year conflict between the missionary education, the people who were involved in missionary education and people who were in the British government. So there's a conflict between them. But missionary education, remember, predates British colonialism. So they came much earlier, they started teaching English, etc. Of course, you have state-directed education, which is directed by the state. So the government decides what you are going to read, what you're going to study, how you're going to study it, etc. But there were also very indigenous forms of education. As I told you, Gurukuls and madrasas in Adams' report are still thriving. And they are still thriving in Hunter's report in 1882. So there are still a lot of Gurukuls and madrasas that are still operating with different names, of course, but the structure is more or less the same. Okay. And these were often very contested forms of teaching. I'll give you just one example. For example, when in 1864, when Arya Samaj came into existence, a large number of one of the things that Arya Samaj did was, or even before that Brahmo Samaj did, was the establishment of schools. Okay. And both Arya Samaj and Brahmo Samaj before that wanted women's education. Now remember, this is a heavily debated area at that point of time. Should women be taught? It's not only what should women be taught. That itself is extremely problematic. But if women are taught, what are they going to be taught? But that leads to other problems. If women are going to come out of the house and go to schools, what are they going to wear? So, what is the dress that they're going to wear? So, there is a huge amount of debate when Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj started promoting women's education. In fact, some of the British missionaries started setting up women's schools. For example, one of the earliest women's schools that was set up in Calcutta was in 1838 by someone called Madame Loreto. It's still there. It's called Loreto's Convent. So, a large number of Hindu women, sometimes Brahmo women, mostly Brahmo women actually, not so many Hindu women, Brahmo women would go to the school in the morning and come back. And because they had to walk down the street, the men mostly resisted. They said they can't walk down the street like this. So what they did, the Loreto teachers, they decided to have a bus for them. In those days, of course, a horse-drawn bus, yeah, which was covered. And the bus had to be stopped because it was stormed for 2 consecutive days, because it was thought that women should not be going to schools at all. So you have these very, very contested, very strongly debated forms of education also there. So I just gave you one example of women's education, but there are other forms as well. For example, 1870s onwards, the idea of Dalit education became a very contested form, etc. And also you have to remember that there are lots of local variations. So the kind of textbooks that you will have, let's say, in Bengal, may not be the same, though you have a centralized system of producing textbooks, may not be the same that were produced in Gujarat or in Bombay. In Kathiawar agency, again to give you a local example, for example, so if you know a bit of a history of Gujarat, when the British came over here, the British resident was placed in Rajkot, yeah? And they formed something called the Kathiawar agency. So the Kathiawar agency was supposed to, all the kings got together and they were supposed to coordinate with each other in terms of education. Bhavnagar was the leader in this. And very early in Bhavnagar, I think it was in 1855, that the first girls' school is established. Now, obviously, no women are allowed to come out. So what the Diwan of Bhavnagar does, Gauri Shankar Ojha, is he takes the queen's daughter, in a big palanquin and says that she is going to school. So if the queen can go to school, the other women can also go to school. So there were different kinds of strategies being employed to produce different forms of education. So there are lots of local variations in what we call textbooks, materials, etc., etc. So we'll have to keep that in mind. If we then come to textbooks, so what were the textbooks? We have been talking about textbooks were used, etc. What were the kind of textbooks? Let's have a look at some of them. But in order to understand the textbooks, you have to keep the context that I've produced in mind, the background that I have given to you. So what were the kind of textbooks that were used at that point of time? Again, an interesting thing, because this debate is coming back today. So should we use bilingual textbooks? So if I am teaching, let's say, in a rural region in Gujarat, should I be using both English and Gujarati? Should I be using only English? Should I be using translation? Should I not be using translation? These are eternal debates in reality. Okay. Should I use only English for certain purposes? Should I use English for certain kinds of specific purposes, Gujarati for certain other specific purposes, etc.? Okay. But these debates were not new, and therefore it is important to know the history, because these debates already existed and you can see them in textbooks. So I'll show you some examples, but in order to understand these examples, I've divided them into 6 phases. So you can see the production of textbooks in 6 distinct phases in during this period, 19th century, early 20th century. Phase 1, of course, this is a very rough distinction, but phase 1 can be seen as 1784 to 1835. 1835, remember, is Macaulay's Minute. And these are initial production of textbooks. So early textbooks that were used mostly by missionaries, but also by local entrepreneurs who wanted to have English education. So local, for example, zamindar, or the local sahuka, or the local seth, who wanted to give English education, and they set up schools. Yeah. Remember, there is no standardized textbooks. People just got hold of anything and then they use them in the classroom. I'll show you some examples of these, mostly dictionaries. From 1835 to 1854 is the second phase, which is between Macaulay's Minutes and Wood's Dispatch. And this has some interesting textbooks. We'll have a look at them and what happened with those textbooks. 1854 to 1870 is a period of centralization. Now, why am I calling it centralization? Because remember 1857, you have the rebellion, or First War of Independence, whatever you want to call it. And after 1857, there is a complete change in the British policy, because they suddenly realized that there is a possibility that there might be another rebellion. And in order to suppress that rebellion, therefore, one of the means that is employed is education. So you make sure that education is completely controlled. We'll see an example of that as well. So you completely control education. So anything, all funds that the government is going to give is only for the kind of education that they want to give. You cannot deviate from that. Okay? If you want funds from the government, you have to, well, follow the government's policies. Yeah. So there is a complete centralization during this period, primarily because of the fear of 1857. Between 1871 to 1882, because of the Governor General, there was someone called William Bentinck, who was a bit more liberal and progressive. There's a kind of reluctant decentralization. So people were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. The local kings were allowed more say in education, etc. From 1882 to 1900, you have the fifth phase. I'll show you examples of all these phases. You have William Hunter's report, if you remember. So the report again produced a certain kind of anxiety in the British, because the report said that English teaching has been a complete failure in the colony. And therefore, there were a lot of new steps that were taken. This is an interesting period. So all those textbooks that you read today, all those companies that you read today, for example, Macmillan, came up during this period. So we have now these companies which see a possibility of profit, because you have these centralized schools now where everyone is going to use a textbook. So Macmillan comes in and starts producing textbooks. And then we'll look at the last phase very briefly, between 1901 to 1990. So what kind of textbooks were produced, let's say, in phase one? So this is phase one. I've given you an example from one of the earliest texts that was produced in the Bombay Presidency. It was used in Gujarat. Okay. This, as you can see, is a kind of a dictionary with, it's available online, so you can go online and see it. Or if you're interested, it's available in the Gujarat Vidyapeeth database, so you can also see it over there. Now, as you can see, this is a translation of an English grammar. Okay. And it is a translation of an English grammar by someone called Mr. Mare into the, as you can see, the spelling Gujarati language, with a commentary by Ardeshar Bharamji. Now, the name is important because the Parsis took an important initiative in education, not only in Gujarat or Bombay Presidency, but across India. This book, the first one that you see over here, was produced in 1808. The second one that you see over here, it's again a translation of Mare's grammar, is 1822. So one of the earliest probably texts that was produced in Gujarati or Marathi. Okay. Now, if you look at the text very closely, I hope you can see this. It has three languages in it. So you have the English, you have the Gujarati, and you have the Marathi. Okay. And these kind of bilingual or trilingual dictionaries were extremely common during this period. So a large number of these bilingual or trilingual dictionaries were taken to the class for teaching of lexical items, for teaching of words. And if you go through this book, you will see that there are also sentences later. So students will practice these sentences, memorize them. So there will be a sentence in Gujarati, there will be a sentence in Marathi, then there will be the translation of that Marathi and Gujarati sentence into English. Okay. So what is the method that is getting followed over here? You can see that it's mostly teaching of grammar. Okay. And this is the model that is used, that is taken from Latin and Greek teaching. So what we call grammar translation method, it has nothing to do with translation, remember. A grammar translation method is, you have a grammatical rule in Latin, you translate that grammatical rule into English or to local languages. Okay. So what you do is you start applying Latin and Greek grammar to Gujarati or Marathi or English or whatever. And just as a kind of an aside, during the nationalist period, 1880s onwards, there is a huge amount of debate on this, that why should we understand Latin and Greek grammar to understand Bengali or to Marathi or Gujarati, etc. We don't need that kind of a grammar because we have our own grammar system. And this grammar system needs to be understood, etc. So there is a lot of debate over there. But originally, during this period, it was mostly Latin and Greek models of grammar that were used for teaching in the classroom. So you will have these kind of words, the vowels, the letters, etc. And then their equivalent in local languages like Marathi and English or Gujarati or Bengali or whatever. And then you will take them into the class and students will mug them up, memorize them. Okay. So there is an attempt at integrating local languages into the classroom. So it's not, I'm going to go and teach English. I'm going to go and teach English with the help of local languages. Okay. And these were very common things. One thing that I must point out over here is that you will see that the English words are printed, but the Gujarati and the Marathi words are not printed, because at that point of time in 1808, Gujarati and Marathi print is not yet available. So you can't print them. So you have to handwrite them. So they are all handwritten over here. Yeah. So this is the first phase. Main teaching method, grammar. Well, grammar-based teaching, but also trilingual, bilingual grammar translation method. It's not really translation from one language to another, but imposing one's language's grammatical rules onto other languages and then use it for translation purposes. So that's how it happens during this period. What happens in the next phase? In 1835 to 1854, remember Macaulay publishes his minute, and after the publication of his minute, he believes that he has been very successful. In fact, he writes a letter to his father, very interesting letter. He says, I'm very hopeful that by the time we are finished with India, that by the time English is taught in India and English spreads across India, they will have forgotten all their superstitious beliefs and they would have forgotten all their languages and everyone is going to become a perfect Englishman, okay? Which of course doesn't happen by 1854. But that's his belief. That's how strongly he believes in. So what kind of books are used during this period after Macaulay? A large number of textbooks are produced. There is a huge amount available again online. I'll just give you two examples. One, for example, the teaching of English, you would take biographies. So you would take biographies of important people and then teach them in the classroom. This is one example. This is the first one, the biographical sketch of David Hare. And this, as you can see, was published in 1821. David Hare is a very famous figure. He was a Scottish Presbyterian, an early missionary educationist, and founded a very famous school, which is still existent in India, called the Hare School. It's still one of the most prestigious schools in Calcutta. Now, after Hare dies, someone writes a biography. Actually, someone called a very well-known Bengali writer writes his biography, his student actually, Bhattacharya Mitra. And then this book is published by the Calcutta School Book Society. So there is a very interesting network that happens. So Bhattacharya Mitra, who is a student of David Hare, he's also the student of Henry de Rosio, one of the earliest poets in English, Indian English. He writes a biography of Hare, gets published by Calcutta School Book Society. And Calcutta School Book Society then says this can be used as a textbook in the classroom. Okay, so Hare's biography is then taught in the classroom, and students are asked questions on this biography. When was he born? When did he die? What was his contribution to English, etc. So there are public examinations based on the book. But you also have these kind of books, which were used, for example, in Gujarat, of short sentences. And as you can see, this book was meant to be used in schools and for private families. Now, remember, private families doesn't mean you and me. Private families actually means the kingly, the royal families. Okay, so because the royal families were supposed to have private tutors, and these books could be used for those private families. And as you can see, these books, I didn't show you examples, but these books generally would have very short sentences in Gujarati and then short sentences in English, and students would practice them. So again, more or less a translation method. I'll not call them grammar translation, a translation method. But this is also the period when we start seeing what we call lessons today. So David Hare's biography was taught as a lesson, which had a moral implication, etc. And the word lesson, even we use that even today in B.Ed, that lesson plan. So lesson actually has two meanings. Lesson is not simply what you are teaching, but lesson is also a moral, it has a moral side to it. So you're also teaching morality, you're giving value education. So that was an important part of English education, of course, at that point of time. Because if you remember, Macaulay also said that it will improve morality of the native citizens. So the purpose of English education was not simply making them proficient in English, but also to give them morality, certain kind of value education. Okay? So this is the second phase. Again, mostly translation, but also early beginnings of lessons. Okay? These kind of biographies that we used. The third phase, there are many textbooks. I'm not going to show them to you, but you have more centralization, as I said. So there is a committee of public instruction that is formed in Calcutta, in Bombay, and Madras. The committee of public instruction decides, including what happens, for example, in Kathiawar agency. So it's not simply Bombay. So Kathiawar agency kings will also have to follow the textbooks that were given by committee of public instruction. There are a large number of textbooks during this period. You also have the beginning of the Indian civil service, what we call UPSC today. So this is the beginning of the Indian civil service. And there is a lot of influence of Indian civil service on education now, because the head of the committee of public instruction is what we will call today an IAS officer, an ICS officer. Yeah? And the ICS officer basically decides which textbooks to use, what are the policies that are going to be used, etc. And because there is a centralized fund disbursement, all funds is with the government, they will disburse the funds, they will decide what you're going to study, what you're going to learn, etc. This is the third phase. We'll just skip over this. The fourth phase, which I call the reluctant decentralization, where people are trying to kind of say, okay, you can do whatever you want to do, is again a very interesting part. This is from 1871 to 1882. And I've just given you an example of the Anglo-Gujarati translation series. And this is the famous textbooks which started in 1854. I'm sure that many of you know about it, people who are interested in a bit of history of education in Gujarat. This was started by Wells. And these became extremely popular. As you can see, the first edition itself had 3,000 copies, which is quite a large number, remember, during that period. And it had second editions and third editions and fourth editions, etc., etc. And as you can see, it was mostly published in Bombay, but some of the copies were also published in Surat and Ahmedabad. And they were used extensively during this period across Gujarat schools, extensively. Okay. As you can see on the left-hand part of the screen, it also tells you how much money was spent on this in Gujarati. And this is one of the most popular, the Wells's textbooks are the most popular books that were produced, almost standardized textbook production during this period in many of the provinces. The same thing happened in Bengal. The influence of someone called Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, again you must have heard his name, also standardized textbooks across schools. So there is a kind of a standardization of textbooks that start happening during this period. So a person studying in Surat and a person studying in Rajkot probably will read the same textbook, which was not true previously. A person studying in Ahmedabad and a person studying in Valsad would probably read the same textbook. Okay? So there is a huge production of textbooks during this period. And these textbooks, again, remember, uses the bilingual method. So there is still a lot of translation that happens because it used Gujarati as well as English, Bengali as well as English. But many textbooks now are produced which are completely in English. So I've given you some sort of an example over here on the, if you look at uh, right, far right of the screen, you will see that there is a complete mixture of the languages. Okay, so it's not now separated. So you have one sentence in in Gujarati followed by English, etc. There's a lot of mixture of languages that happens. This, unfortunately, is going to disappear as we proceed, and it's very common now. Well, you will find it difficult probably if you see a textbook like this in the classroom today. But these were the most common things at that point of time. So bilingual education, trilingual education was very, very common. It was very common to have textbooks with both the languages. So it's not something that we have to rethink, and we have to kind of we have to think in terms of, oh, we are doing something great today if we are talking about multilingual education, etc. Okay, because this was already there 100 years back. So it's not, we are just reinventing the wheel. So that's why I said it's important to understand that there is a part of history behind it. So when we talk about multilingual education today, well, it has been there. We have tried it. And it has been fairly successful. It's not that it has been unsuccessful. People have learned English. People have learned both the languages at the same time. Let's move on to the fifth phase, which now, remember, this is also the period, just kind of this again in the fourth phase. This is also the period that a large number of women's education starts happening. This is one textbook from Bengal. I'll just read out. I'm sure that many of you won't be able to read the script. So it's called Nari Siksha, the text. And this was originally published by a Brahmo Sabha women's organization. It was called Bama Bodhini Sabha. And there's a lot of these very specific texts for women. So women, remember in those days, you had women's schools, women only schools. You didn't have any concept of co-education. And these women only schools needed specific kind of textbooks. So one can probably go back to this period and see what kind of textbooks were produced for women, especially. This is one example, okay? And this is, so the title says Nari Siksha, and underneath the title, the subtitle is the first part, okay? Pratham Bhag, okay? All of you can understand what Pratham Bhag is. And so similarly, you had 8 bhags of this. So over 8 years, this text will be used. And if you go through the text, it's a very interesting text because you will have moral lessons, how women should behave, what women should eat, what women should not do, etc. You will have moral lessons. But you also have science. For example, how is cloud formed? How do rains happen? So there's a lot of science in it. There's a bit of what they used to call homemaking maths, okay? So basic calculation, etc. and English. So the same text, which is printed in Bengali, would also have English lessons in it. So one can do a fantastic amount of work only looking at women's texts that were produced at a certain point of time. Yeah. And that will tell you a lot about how these textbooks have changed over a period of time. This was just an aside. So let's go to phases 5 and 6, the last 2 phases. Now, as I said, that what happens during this period is there is a rise of nationalism, and the British government gets more and more anxious about what kind of education should be given. So they think more in terms of standardized textbooks, which can be controlled. Okay, so what we have in the form of textbook boards today, okay, are basically a legacy of British colonialism, because textbook boards can basically control what you can read, because you have one textbook that textbook board decides has to be read by everyone, irrespective of where you come from, what languages do you speak, etc. Everyone has to read the same English text. Okay, and this is the period when it starts happening. And because you needed huge amounts of production of textbooks, remember there are 20,000 students. Now, organizations like Calcutta School Book Society, it started in 1817, could not produce those many textbooks. You needed professional publishers. And this is the time when companies like Macmillan started coming in. This is also the time when the British government starts applying more and more pressure on what can be taught. Remember, in 1895, the Sedition Act, well, the Sedition Act had different forms even before that, but in 1895, there is something called the Sedition Act, which the government brings in and says that anyone who is writing against the government or against the British Empire or against the Queen or against any of the policy of the government is going to be basically put into jail. Okay? So I'll tell you a story before we stop with this. So Bal Gangadhar Tilak is in the board of the Bombay School Book Society, Bombay School Textbook Board, Committee of Public Instruction. Okay? And they publish a very famous series of Marathi textbooks known as Balbodh. It's still there. So Balbodh is used for teaching of Marathi mostly, but you have Balbodh series in English, etc. In one of the lessons, what happens is there is a story of Shivaji. But the story is told in such a way that it seems that Shivaji becomes a symbolic figure fighting against the British Empire. Okay. The textbook is banned by the Bombay Governor General, whoever it was. Tilak is imprisoned, and he's one of the earliest people to be tried under the Sedition Act. It's a very, very cruel act. You cannot get bail, the state can simply imprison you without any evidence, etc. And there is, of course, Tilak is released after 2 years, a large number of people fight for him, etc. But you can see how centralized it is becoming now. So everything has to be standardized. So some of the things that are produced during this period, as you can see, are, so the production of dictionaries continues. You have English Gujarati dictionary, for example, but you also have the production of the second kind of textbooks you see on the screen. So these textbooks, so you have these primers that are produced now. And this is produced by Macmillan again. And as you can see, they were locally produced, for example, booksellers and publishers in Pankod and Ahmedabad, but they were originally produced by Macmillan. Now remember, most of them are now completely in English. Though the title page might have Gujarati, they're mostly in English. There is no Gujarati in the textbook now. So everything is sanitized now. So Gujarati is taken out, it's only teaching of English. And one of the most popular textbook is the third picture that you see is the Citizen of India. This is a compulsory textbook that is introduced across all classrooms. It's again produced by Macmillan, introduced in 1897. The date is important. This is the time when the Tilak controversy happens. And it is compulsory reading because it tells you what makes you the ideal citizen of India. Now remember, India at that time, it's not independent India, right? It's a British Empire. So what makes you the ideal citizen of the British Empire? How you should follow the government rules, how you should follow the government policies, how you should not go into protests, how you should not bunk classes, what kind of an ideal taxpayer you should be. So every chapter is like this. And it also tells you about the glories of the British Empire and the glories of the British past, etc. And you should all become this ideal citizen. So it becomes compulsory reading, okay, across all schools. The third question that I raised, and that we are going to come to that. So this is basically a history of the textbooks, is materialist production, right? So what were the methods that were used? How are these textbooks taught in the classroom? Now, again, there is not much evidence over here, but you can find some examples from people who studied during this period. For example, when Tagore talks about his early education, you can find what kind of things did teachers do in the classroom. When Gandhi, for example, talks about his early education in Porbandar, in Rajkot, in Bhavnagar, etc., we also get a glimpse of what kind of teaching used to happen in the classroom. So we don't have any direct evidence of what kind of things teachers did in the classroom. We have indirect evidence of what what kind of teaching used to happen in the classroom. So I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So what were the common things? So I told you about this biography. Yeah. So how was a biography taught, or how are these lessons taught? Till 1920, you had a major test on dictation. I don't know how many of you actually did dictation when you were in school. I'm not very sure many of you did it. But you used to have a major test in dictation, 50 marks. Okay. You were supposed to listen to the teacher, write in your notebook. In olden days, in 1860s and 70s, you would be given a big slate. You have to write with chalk on that slate and then submit that slate to the class teacher. The class teacher will mark you on the slate, and then it will be sent to the Committee of Public Instruction or the presidency or the head of the school, and that will be entered in your mark sheet, because the dictation played a very, very important role. Now, it will be interesting to ask the question, why dictation? Why was dictation used as a teaching method? Sometimes not even understand what you were writing. As long as you heard the word, you simply wrote. Now, because remember, from the very early times, the idea in the colonies was to produce writers. Okay? People who could write in English. It didn't matter whether you could speak in English or not. But as long as you could write in English, so writing was given much more importance than any other skill. You have to listen and write. Your boss tells you, this is the order that you have to write. You must be able to type it or write it. Okay, so writing was very, very important. And this is not only true of Indians, even English officers who were employed in India. One of the major things that was tested was whether their handwriting was good. Okay. I'm sure that many of you who studied in convent schools or other schools, I'm sure, had this thing called cursive writing. Okay. So it's very important that you have beautiful handwriting and you could write properly. And so dictation played a very important role in teaching methodology. So you had the ability to write. And because you had the ability to write, sometimes without even understanding what you're writing, you could get a job because you had a good handwriting and you could write in English. Yeah. The second method that is very common during all these periods is, as I said, bilingual translation. Now, there was 20 marks, sometimes 30 marks given for every exam on bilingual translation. So translating from the local language into English. Never the reverse. It was never English to the local language. It was always from Gujarati into English, from Marathi into English, from Odia into English, from Bengali into English. It was never from English to Bengali. Yeah. Again, the reason was the same, because there would be large number of documents that would be available in local languages, and the English needed to translate. So you needed to have that capability of bilingual translation. This was again tested. It was a major test, especially in Standard 8 and Standard 10, what we call Standard 10 today. You would have exams on dictation. You would have exams on bilingual translation. So you would be given a short passage in Gujarati. You had to translate it. Gandhiji, for example, took it in his matriculation exams. The third thing, of course, was memory-based exercises. So if you remember when I was talking about the David Hare biography, you had, so you would be given different kinds of dates, you would be given different kinds of information about someone or something, and then you had to produce that through memory. Very importantly was grammar activities, and you have huge amounts of grammar books, especially in the fourth and the fifth phase, from around 1870s to 1890s, huge amount of grammar books. Now, again, a bit of a digression over here. I'll just take 2 minutes. See, grammar in the colonies in India was originally not meant for teaching. If you look at early grammar writing, for example, the Grammar of Bengali Language, which was published in 1778 by someone called Atanu. He was a British guy, British man who simply wrote a grammar of Bengali language. The grammar of Gujarati language, for example. Now, these grammars were not written for teaching purposes. These grammars were primarily written for understanding the local language. So if you know the grammar of the local language, the belief was you will be able to understand the language. Later, these grammars became an important part of teaching as well. So now you had bilingual grammar. So if a Kriya Pad, for example, works in a certain way in Gujarati, how does it work in English? So you could have these bilingual methods of teaching. And it became an important teaching method, grammar. But you have to keep this in mind that original grammars, when they were written in India by the British, were not meant for teaching. They were meant primarily, but they became very handy later. They were primarily meant for understanding the local language. But they became very handy because now you have a grammar of Gujarati language, you have the grammar of English language, obviously. Now you can combine them and show them how grammar of Gujarati works, how grammar of English works, etc. Remember, no listening, hardly, and no speaking. There would not be any speaking test at all. Okay. It was only at a much later phase in the 1860s and 70s during the Indian civil service you used to have, like today in UPSC, you had the interviews where you had to speak. You had the ability to speak. And it's this format of public examination that started standardizing textbooks. So the more public examinations you have, the more standardized textbooks you will need. Okay? And this finally led to what we are seeing today. We have more standardized textbooks. So you send your children or you go to any school, more or less the textbooks will be the same. Yeah. So you have standardized tests and standardized public examinations. Based on that, you have standardized textbooks. I'll just show you some examples, and this is thanks to one of the PhD scholars of your department, Tanmay. So he had gone to Bhavnagar to send to Alfred School in Bhavnagar, and the dictionary is a treasure trove of these kind of books. He could take pictures of only about 150, and he could record only about 200. But there are thousands of books like this from different periods of time used for teaching of English. Okay. And as you can see, these are of different types. So you have the high school English grammar. This was published in 1915. You have an elementary English grammar. So a lot of grammar books are there. Again, 1911. But you have, for example, paraphrase and précis writing. So these all became a part of public examination. You have translation exercises, etc., etc. Okay, so all sorts of books were used for what we call textbooks today. Just to give you a feel of what they meant, and this is again from the Bhavnagar archive, this is how grammar was taught. So I'll just read the first sentence. This grammar is intended for boys, remember boys, not girls, for boys learning English by the direct method. So this time you already have methods evolving. So the first method, remember it's the direct method, it's not the bilingual method. So it's only English now in the class. By the direct method, and is written more particularly to meet the requirements of the upper classes in high schools. And then of course it tells you how to go about it, how to use the book, etc. So you can get some evidence of teaching and methods from these books. And we'll have to spend some time to find these books. Unfortunately, these books are dying. So I hope that some of you are inspired enough to go and look for these books in your local areas, in your local libraries. It's important to document them. Otherwise, if you don't know your history, you don't know anything, basically. So you need to know your history. So you need to know what happened over here, what kind of teaching happened. Maybe we'll be able to come to something new from that lessons that we learn from history, that lessons that we learn from the past. Yeah. So finally, what are the things that you can do? And I hope that some of you take this up, is what we call textbooks today were not standardized historically. As I tried to show you, there were different kinds of textbooks. They had different purposes. They had different teaching methods. There were different variations, etc. So it's not a simple homogeneous thing that you do materials production and a textbook is produced. It's not that at all. there is a long history of production of textbooks and need to understand that. There were lots of debates. Debates that we are doing today may already have been there long time back. So it's important to go back to those debates and see what did they say. And then maybe we'll be able to find a solution to the problems that we have today. So as I said, there is non-standard, local, community-based, region-based, local pedagogical practices. There is a lot of variations in this. Local teaching methods, they're all valid. For example, the Montessori method that was employed again in Gujarat for a very long time. Okay? The Gijubai Bhattacharya's, for example, experiment, which was very different from English education as such. So we need to go back to these things and see what sort of experiments happen. Maybe we can bring some of that back, etc. So we have multiple directions, complex overlaying of methods. So we have different kinds of methods. We need to look at regional histories. We need to look at what happened in Kathiawar, what happened in Surat, what happened in Ahmedabad. Because remember, they were not completely under the British control. What happened in the Adivasi regions? What kind of education happened over there? So we need to look at those regional histories. And in order to understand that, of course, we need to look at the text histories. So what kind of texts were produced? What was the nature of print? What do we call a book? So what is a book? That's a very important question to ask. Is it simply something in today's world, in digital world, what is a book? I mean, is it something that has to be printed, needs to have a cover? It's something that is a digital text is also a book. How do you define a book? Because the nature of the book itself changes as different sorts of technology change, etc. I showed you an example of a handwritten grammar of Gujarati and Marathi with printed text. That's a different kind of a book than a completely printed book. So what is the nature of the book itself is something, a larger question that you might need to ask. I think I'll stop over here, and if I'll be more than happy to take questions, your comments, whatever you would like to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for such a compelling and thought-provoking session. Your insights into the complex dynamics of colonialism, education, and material production have provided us with valuable perspective to reflect upon. Now we open the floor for questions and discussions. Please feel free to share your thoughts, queries, or reflections with Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very interesting session, and a line which you say that if you don't know history, you don't know anything. It was very relevant. And as you rightly pointed out, that these are the areas which needs to be researched a lot. And you also mentioned Tanmay, one of my research scholar, who is working on the same area. I'm sure we'll be able to come up with a comprehensive report for other research scholars and students and faculty to read and understand. My question, like, in fact, I had a question in mind when I was listening to you. When we are talking of new education policy right now, and when there are a lot of changes being made, so what will be the impact of these changes according to the research which you are doing right now, the project which you are doing, and as you rightly pointed out, many people are working on the same. Now we are talking of primary education in native language, class 1 to 7. So, and what will be its impact on English as a language in future? If we can discuss that, and then we'll take questions from students.
Yeah, thank you, Sunil. This is a very comprehensive question, but I'll just like to focus on two things. So one of the things that you must have noticed on NEP and everyone is the idea of multilingual education. So you bring education in local languages into the classroom. Now, remember, it requires huge amount of efforts on our parts, because not what has happened, and again, it helps you to understand this history. So after 1890s and 1900, as I try to show, what started happening was a standardization. So anything, so for example, the Universities Act. The Universities Act of 1905 standardized all forms of textbooks in higher education into English. So you didn't have any other things, which was not true in the 1850s and 60s. As I was trying to show, there are a huge amount of bilingual textbooks available. Okay. And one of the ways of doing it probably is to bring back that earlier form. So you need to think of bilingualism as something that is embedded in our genetic system. No Indian can be monolingual. You are born a bilingual. The moment you take birth, you are a bilingual person. Okay, if not trilingual or tetralingual or pentalingual at times. And if you realize that, then it is absolutely normal for us to have bilingual and trilingual textbooks. Now, what does it require? One, of course, requires huge amount of injection of funds for translation. So you need people who would be able to incorporate this idea. See, the idea is not that you just teach one language. Because again, if you go back to one language, we go back to the monolingual model. That one language has to be taught till this age, then another language has to be taught at certain other age, etc. It's possible, and there's a lot of research on this in neurosciences, etc., that it's very common for children to pick up 2 or more languages very quickly. It's not very difficult for them. So maybe we'll have to think in those terms where you have 2 or 3 languages coming to the classroom at the same time, but not as separate languages. So one of the things that we saw in early textbooks is that languages are integrated within the same textbook. It's not that you are learning English, then you are learning Gujarati, then you are learning Hindi. You can have a textbook with Gujarati, Hindi, English together in the same classroom, and why not? This is one response that I would like to give. The second one that I would like to give is that this idea where that NEP talks about is, for example, is to bring back, which I didn't talk about much at all, is to bring back, for example, earlier indigenous systems of knowledge into the classroom. Now, there's again quite a lot of work. For example, I can give you a lot of examples from Bengal, but there is a lot of work in Maharashtra as well, where earlier forms of teaching, for example, or earlier forms of pedagogic impulses were brought back very, very successfully. And there have been studies on this, where I'm not saying you bring back the old Gurukul method. That may not be possible today. But there are certain methods that can be employed that were employed over there. For example, one of the most important method of Gurukul teaching was what was known as mnemonics. You memorize. And memorization is something that plays an important role in neural development. I mean, that's very common knowledge that the more you remember, the more your brain starts functioning. So we might have to go back into those as well, especially in the 18th and the 19th century, the methods of teaching. For example, when we think of Gurukul or madrasa, we always think in terms of, oh, they are, old-fashioned. Let me tell you, a large number of madrasa education actually includes a huge amount of science and English teaching. So many of their syllabi are actually aligned with what we do in other classrooms. The only requirement in a madrasa education, for example, is that they need to have religious teaching. The same thing happened with Gurukuls. Gurukuls doesn't mean that you just simply learn the old ancient texts. There was a lot of modern scientific knowledge that were being taught in Gurukuls. And it will be interesting to go back to this. And therefore, we need a bit of more research in this. What did they teach? How did they teach? What was the kind of methodology that was employed over there? Okay, with no English, remember. And many of these people, I can give you hundreds of examples from Bengal, who became major intellectuals, including Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was very proficient in English, studied in a very small Gurukul in a very small town in Midnapur. Okay. So there must have been something in the system that could help them to learn other languages so quickly, that could help them to produce knowledge in other forms of education. So maybe we'll need to look into that as well.
True. Yeah.
So, hello, Atanu. So I actually congratulate you to introduce a new topic that is in ELT called material production. So although it is not directly related to our MS students, but when we discussed informally, then we also sorted out that material production they should know along with their skills, language skills. My only query is here. So when the books were written and you historicized the textbook production over a period of 19th century, the entire 100 years, you expanded into different phases. Then now, what's your take on these books? Once we, for example, look at the present scenario, and the new books are prescribed by CBSE or ICSE or IB boards, and so now, for example, we have this common NEP 2020, and now we are already in 24, and we ourselves are the stakeholders. We don't know, and the textbook production is one unit, and the transfer of knowledge by the teachers in another unit. Teacher training is another unit. So the students are our stakeholders, stakeholders, they don't know. So we entertain interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. So at the center, if we keep textbooks and we make an attempt as a researchers to revive these old textbooks again, or some implement some methods recommended by the writers of the textbooks. And will they be applicable in the present scenario?
It's a very interesting question. Actually, we do have something in ELT called languages across the curriculum. It's called the LAC. There has been in the 90s, especially, there was a lot of research on languages across the curriculum. So language across the curriculum is basically English. You don't teach English as a subject. You teach English across the curriculum, for example, in environmental sciences and sciences, etc., where automatically students start picking up language across the curriculum, etc. Now, again, if you go back to this, the entire 19th century, one of the examples that I gave you is the textbook called Nari Siksha. Now, as I told you, the Nari Siksha textbook is a very interesting textbook in itself. So you have moral lessons for women, which was at that point of time thought to be important. But you have science, you have environment, you have stories, you have biographies of famous women scientists, for example, or famous women authors. And you have basic maths and English, all of them combined in the same textbook. Now, would it be possible to do something like that, for example, in the classroom today? Would it be advisable? Because it would require a huge amount of change. Because our examination patterns are so set now. The CBSE already has an examination pattern, ICSE has an examination pattern, IB has an examination pattern. And what we call in ELT as a washback. So a testing always has a washback. So the washback is either can be positive. So testing has a good effect on teaching or learning. Testing can have a bad effect on teaching and learning, which is what is happening with our students. So all my MS students come to me after 2 months of teaching, they say, sir, question kaisa aayega? Which is a bad effect. कि सर क्वेश्चन कैसे पूछेंगे आप 5 आएंगे इंटरनल ऑप्शन आएंगे पिछले साल के क्वेश्चन में क्या आया था इस साल के क्वेश्चन में क्या आया है और ये वाला क्वेश्चन आएगा सर ये तो आपने पढ़ाया नहीं था etc. So the focus is not on learning, so it's a negative washback of the examination. What is happening? Because I can understand, because people want 60%, 65, 70, सर मेरिट में नहीं आएगा फिर हम लोग को जॉब नहीं मिलेगा etc. Which is also a kind of a curse of the colonial legacy, because you needed to score well in order to get a job. So it requires a huge amount of change. Now, are we ready to go through that change? That's the question. Ideally, in a utopian sense, we should. But I don't think it is possible because it requires a huge amount of investment. It requires a huge amount of teacher training, teacher education, re-education of teachers, re-education of the entire education system, which is extremely difficult. But as teachers, we are always utopian. Hopefully, something better will come out of this.
It was an interesting topic, and as Bhattacharya rightly said, we have opened a new area which one would definitely think about. Regarding the use of the word colonialism that you have used, and if we look at the text, for example, as the production of the materials, and here I use the word materials not in the sense of the text which is written by the creative writers, but other books, for example, maybe critical analysis or whatever. So in the present scenario, looking at the technologies that we do have of AI or ChatGPT, again I will repeat, I am not talking about the creative text written by creative writers, but the other types of the production of the materials. So do not think that these technologies will definitely hamper the production of the text as materials. I mean, with reference to the thinking of a writer.
If I've understood your question correctly, Amit, one of the things that human beings are very scared of is technology. Though we claim that we love technology, but we are generally very scared of it. So if you look at the history of technology, human beings have reacted to technology generally with a negative sense. Because there is always this fear. What will happen if robots come and conquer? And therefore, you have a whole genre of literature on this. You have the speculative fiction, you have Frankenstein, you have the monster created by the human, etc. So I'm not very sure what role will AI play in the future. And I'm sure that everyone knows about it. Amazon actually now publishes AI texts. So an AI generated text, there are already about 50 novels that have been published that have been written by AIs. Okay, so you don't need an author anymore. So you don't need human beings in that sense. And you can buy them on Amazon. So that's not a problem. So they're legal, they're not illegal. About the materials that you are asking, I'm not very sure what the nature of the materials are going to be. Because if you remember, you correctly pointed out that testing sometimes determines the material. So for example, if I'm teaching a Shakespeare in the classroom, I will need to give students some help with that Shakespeare. And that help now has become a whole industry. So you have huge amounts of notes and guides and all that. I'm sure that industry, at least the print industry, is going to die down. Because you have so much of material on the net now, you don't really need it. Okay. In fact, nowadays I'm scared of going to the classroom because my students might know actually more if they research more. Because there's so much material that I don't have access to. So the nature of material, you are right, would change, but I don't think it will completely go digital in that sense. It will never go digital in that sense, at least not in the next 100, 150 years. Because remember, print technology has been here since 800, 900 years. And in order to completely replace it, I'm not very sure whether that will be possible right now. But you're right, the nature of material will change. It will definitely change from what is happening now.
Sir, I was only worried about in the sense that if we more depend on these machines for thinking instead of we as the human beings will think, then it will also disturb us and we are going into the machine colonialization, I think. We are to be colonized by these technological tools or whatever.
That's always the fear, Amit bhai. See, the problem is you can't. What is the time now? Amit bhai, what is the time now?
No, we have to look at the watch, the time of machine. I understood.
That's a machine. See, you can't even tell the time without a machine.
No, that's okay, sir. I can depend on a watch as a machine to know the time. But machine should not hamper my thinking independently. That was only my
That
worry
is
or
true.
anything. Yeah.
So there is a very famous saying by someone in the 1970s, actually. He was a person who was very interested in technology. So he was asked the question that you are making all these teaching implements with technology. Do you think technology will replace the teacher? So his answer was very interesting. He said, if a technology can replace the teacher must be replaced.
If you don't update yourself, you will be replaced. Any questions?
One or two questions can be.
80% of this, this batch, they have opted for ELT. So they have some background of ELT. And in fact, when we were talking of Macaulay, right? I also consider him as a villain. Because his lines like Indian in blood and color and British in taste. So somewhere he was responsible, sir. But now when you have said, I would agree to what you have said, and then further research on it to find details about it. Yeah, any questions? Yes, sir. You can ask the question.
संभळाचे नाही नाही
Hello, sir. Yes, but my question is just whatever Sonika said. I mean, the same thing I was just discussing. I'm not well read of things that you are discussing, but I just is it okay, sir?
Yeah, you're audible, but it's coming a bit fuzzy. So if you can just speak up a bit loudly.
All right. So I just wanted to say that you said that.
I can't hear you at all. Okay.
I will be transferring the data.
Okay. Okay.
If I could get what his question was, as per the discussion which you conducted, that Indian English started much before Macaulay.
Hmm.
That is what was discussed earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and he still has some doubt that it was Macaulay also responsible for the same. Am I right, sir?
Missionary education.
Okay,
Yeah, so English education, remember, came. I'm not only talking about English education. So, education as a form, what we know as the Western form.
The English.
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay now, sir?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so you mentioned that Macaulay has not, Macaulay's minute has not impact on English India.
Right.
But you said that when missionary came and they started unleashing the Indian speaking Indian language on Indian continent. But well, that was fine. Even if we just look back in Chartered Act, 1930, and Chartered Act talks about that he also gave the permission of British people to civilize Indian,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
Indian.
yeah.
Even that also impacted Indian English. If
Yes.
that. And apart from that, even if you talk about Macaulay's minute, so Macaulay's minute, I believe that it was not even that much impactful, but it was they set up the foundation for English in India. And apart after Macaulay's minute, there was a Wood Dispatch. So Wood Dispatch just was talking about that what was the plan for Macaulay's minute and what were the kind of things which were not even implemented yet. And it was instincting that why we are not able to implement the
Yeah.
things that we discussed in Macaulay's minute. And after that, the universities that you just talked about in 1857, the university
Wind up, to narrate.
yeah. I'm just narrating the question. So the universities, it was was there in that Wood Dispatch, and that University Act was 1902. So all the things, the whole from the Macaulay's minute until now, just because of Macaulay's minute, I would say it was catalyst of Indian English.
Right. Right. Okay. So I'll give a very quick response to this. Okay. So what happens, one of the problems of doing history is that you can look at history from the winner's point of view. Okay. So let's say the British. Now, unfortunately, what has happened is the British were very good with documentation. They would preserve everything. Okay, any handwritten, any piece, they will have it in the archive. So Macaulay's minute gained a certain kind of a, shall I say, notoriety. It's became a bit infamous, primarily because it was archived for a very long time. But if you actually go back to the regional writings, okay, which unfortunately has not been archived that much. I can give you examples from Bengali and Odia. There was a huge resistance to what we call Macaulay's minute now. So if you look at it from the point of view of Macaulay's minute, that Macaulay's minute came and established English in India, then we are in a bit of a trouble because we are not looking at the other side. What did the Indians do? It's not that the Indians were simply sitting over there and saying, okay, Macaulay's minute has come, what to do now? We have to learn English. There was a huge amount of resistance. People opened different sorts of schools which refused to teach English. People used English as just a functional language. That, okay, you need to learn English to get a job. We'll teach you that, but we'll teach other things to you as well. So it's not that Macaulay's minute immediately transformed into a well-entrenched English education system. It is an important historical document, which you can say for a certain point of time that, yes, it was influential because it kind of started what we now called English education formally. It's not that English education started with Macaulay. There was a lot of English education before Macaulay. But formally, the British policy was geared towards English education. But as I told you, even in Hunter's report in 1882, Hunter actually calls it a failure. So English education has not spread in India as much as they wanted it to. Now, why was that failure there? So obviously, there was a lot of resistance from other quarters. And that resistance is also important to study. I'm not saying Macaulay is irrelevant. Macaulay is, of course, important. But equally important is the other voices that are available. Now, if you ignore those voices, then Macaulay becomes more important. So we have to also address those voices.
For everyone present here, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Bhattacharya for his invaluable contribution to today's session. I also express my gratitude to Dr. Sunil Shah for chairing this session and guiding the discourse so effectively. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for being here with us from Kolkata. And in fact, the background which you are using right now.
It's just a record.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, you were not here with us offline, but actually, if you look at the projection here, and we could feel that you are very much here with us. Beautiful, yeah. And you are there on YouTube as well. So on behalf of department, we are grateful. Next time, we want a promise from you that you will be here offline and students will come to interact with you.
Very soon, in February, we'll be together.
Okay, sir.
So
Thanks to the department.
Dr. Jaideep Sarang is here.
জয়দীপ কেমন আছো ভালো?
Switching, code switching, isn't it? Thank you so much. I could.
We'll meet.
Yeah,
We'll meet Jaydeep. Yeah, we'll definitely meet.
We'll
Yeah.